everyone. Good morning, good evening, or whatever time it is out there. Welcome to our second Animal Behavior live seminar. My name is Saeed Shafi Sabet, and I'm gonna chair the session today. Today's speaker is Professor Culum Brown. I'm honored to welcoming him for just joining us today. Just a brief overview of his career. He received his PhD at the University of Queensland, Brisbane, Australia in 2000. He did 2 postdocs at the Department of Animal Behaviour, University of Cambridge, in the UK, 1999 till 2002. So he actually started his postdoc in Cambridge before his PhD was conferred. He was then a research fellow at the University of Edinburgh in the UK for 3 years, 2002 till 2004. Afterwards, he continued his scientific career as a lecturer in animal behavior at School of Biological Sciences, University of Canterbury in New Zealand, 2004 to 2006. And finally, since 2006, he has been working as a professor in Department of Biological Sciences, Macquarie University. He's a behavioral ecologist with a special interest in fish cognition and welfare, having published more than 160 articles in this field. He's also the principal investigator of the Fish Lab Behavior, Ecology, and Evolution of Fishes Laboratory. He studies fish behavioral ecology, comparative cognition, focusing on learning and memory, cerebral lateralization, and personality. The title of his presentation is Smart Sharks. Just a quick reminder, the talk will last for 40 minutes and will be followed by 15 minutes Q&A. You are most welcome to ask your questions on the YouTube chat. You can also mention your university, department, and also country. Okay, cool. Follow is yours, Culum. Go for it.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for the invitation to letting me speak to an international audience. It's 7 o'clock here in the evening in the middle of winter, just to get you an idea. And we're in the middle of lockdown as well. We've been locked down for the last 4 weeks. We can't even leave the house. So today, basically what I'm going to do is provide an overview of how people think about sharks in general. Hopefully I'll be able to illustrate to you that our fear of sharks is irrational. And then I'm going to cover a whole bunch of experiments that we've been doing in my lab over the last couple of years looking at shark intelligence. And hopefully I'll be able to prove to you by the end of this that sharks are not mindless killers. They're smart for one thing, and they're not out to get you. So hopefully by the end of that, you'll realize what the reality is. Of course, I think it'd be fair to say that the media really likes nothing more than a good shark story. And if it's a shark attack story, even better. These sorts of things often make headlines around the world, and they're really over-sensationalized. The reports you hear are really playing on our instinctive fear of the water, the unknown, and you know, the monsters that perhaps are lying beneath the surface. And I think it would be fair to say that it all went horribly wrong for sharks from a public relations perspective in 1975, when Jaws was unleashed on moviegoers around the world. And of course, this soundtrack is arguably the most widely recognized of any in movie history. And I suspect that for many of us, when we get in the water, you can't help but think, perhaps this is what's going to happen to me. And of course, Jaws started a whole new genre of movies, the shark horror genre, and that has, well, literally gone from strength to strength. And there are countless shark attack movies now. You could literally sit down and watch them back to back, non-stop, and it would take you weeks to watch them all. It's huge. And you really can't discount the impact that this sort of Hollywood visualization or interpretation of shark behavior has had on society right around the world. Look, I think the reality is sharks do occasionally bite people, but they certainly don't eat people. And sharks actually are far more interested in things like eating fishes, eating seals, and perhaps munching on a few turtles. They certainly don't eat people. Here's a tally of shark bites from around the world, and you can see that the US is doing reasonably well up there in front, and Australia is second. But you have to keep in mind that the population of the US is about 10 times that of Australia. And so if you correct for population, you actually find that the number of bites per 1,000 people is far higher in Australia than anywhere else. And the United States isn't second. In fact, it's way after New Zealand. So, you know, Australia and New Zealand have per capita a decent number of shark incidents. And I suspect that is a testament to the reasonably good fishing policies that we have in our waters. Our fisheries management is quite good, and our waters are still relatively in good condition. So we get a gold medal, since the Olympics has just finished, for shark bites. So, you know, let's get the facts about shark attacks, and the best place to get these facts from an Australian perspective is the Australian Shark Attack File, which is maintained by Taronga Zoo. And in fact, there's really loads of cool information about sharks and shark attacks, statistics and analyses and ways to avoid and prevent shark attacks on this page. And it's well and truly worth a visit. There's a similar page maintained in the US. And if you look at that data, well, what does the data say in terms of shark bites in Australia? Well, what you see is on average, we get about 25 bites per annum, and that's pretty consistent from year to year. The fatalities jump up and down. Normally we have 0, 1, perhaps 2, but last year we had 8. It went totally off the scale. We haven't seen anything like that for about 100 years. So that was an extremely unusual year. Nobody's really sure what it was about this particular year. We've had 1 fatality so far, so we're pretty much back to normal this year. So I think it'd be fair to say that despite the hype, just about everything that you can think of is more likely to kill you than a shark. And here's some interesting statistics from Australia. If you look at the shark attack file, you find that over the last 100 years, about 137 people have been killed by sharks, which is just over 1 person per year on average. How many people are killed in Australia by car accidents? About 1,000 times more. So, you know, if you're going to be scared of anything, you should really be terrified of getting in your car every day. Most people do that without thinking. How about the people who drown? About 300 people a year, you know, 250 times more people. So it's way more dangerous just to get in the water. A shark's not going to get you. The chances are you're going to drown. How about people who are killed by horses? 20 per annum. And killer bees. How about the killer bees? This is a standard European bee. 10 people die in Australia every year from being bitten by bees. So, you know, of all the things that you should be concerned about, sharks probably wouldn't make the top 100. So despite what the media would, and probably Hollywood, would have you believe, sharks are not out to get you. And clearly our fear of sharks is completely irrational. And humans actually aren't very good at calculating these sorts of risks. Often our emotions get the better of our mind. Here's a pretty modern phenomenon. It'd be interesting if people can tell me at the end of this presentation how many people in their country die every year while taking selfies. And I can guarantee you it'll be way more than people killed by sharks, particularly if in Switzerland, because there's not too many sharks in Switzerland. Now, I think you know, you might have got the point by now, but just in case you haven't quite figured it out, here's some interesting maths and stats. Now, in Australia, we have this thing called Cat's Lotto. It's effectively the lotto. You know, you buy a ticket and there's a very slim chance that you might actually win. Now, statistically, in Australia, in the system that's called Cat's Lotto, you're more likely to win First Division twice in a row than you are to be killed by a shark. And I doubt anybody has ever said to their kids, or indeed a teacher has said to their pupils, you know what, forget about school, you don't need a job, buy a lotto ticket and your future is set. And the reason they don't say that is because there's this very, very slim chance that you're ever going to win Cat's Lotto. But you're twice as likely to win Cat's Lotto than you are being bitten by a shark. So I think the other thing we need to keep in mind is, despite the fact that everybody immediately thinks of things like white sharks, great white sharks when we mention sharks, the reality is the vast majority of the 1,000 or so species are actually benthic. So they actually live on the sea floor, and most of these guys don't even have sharp, pointy teeth. And I think you'll agree, looking at these pictures over here, that some of them, well, they're downright cute. And these things aren't terrifying. This is the Port Jackson shark. I've been bitten by Port Jackson sharks, I can't tell you how many times. And at worst, you get a mean-looking hickey, and that's about it. So a bit of bruising and not much more. And you can see why. This is the Port Jackson shark jaw. And incidentally, if you go to this, this command here, you can have a look at these in 3D and zoom in, zoom out, and rotate them in space. This is on the Macquarie University website. You can see here, this is a typical jaw from a benthic shark. They've got some sort of grippy teeth at the top, but the rest of it really is a whole bunch of molars. And these things are really designed for crunching on things like crabs and prawns and the occasional seashell, bivalves, and mollusks, those sorts of things. So the vast majority of species, their teeth look like this. On the other side over here, we have the jaw of a tiger shark. Tiger sharks are a little bit unusual in that their teeth are actually pointing sideways, which is kind of weird. But they're sharp and pointy and jaggedy, and these things are obviously designed for taking chunks out of things. And tiger sharks, well, they're kind of renowned as the scavengers of the ocean, the garbage cleaners, if you like. They go around and they'll eat anything, taking chunks out of whale carcasses, biting a turtle, you name it, they'll eat it. So these guys clearly have very sharp, pointy teeth. And these are the ones, of course, that you've got to worry about if you do get bitten by a shark. But the point is, the vast majority of the species, they look like this. They're not going to hurt you. And because of our fear of sharks and our seemingly irrational need to kill them all, sharks are in real trouble. I mean, apart from the fact that we massively overfish them, there's just no empathy for them. So conserving them or convincing people to conserve them is really hard work, hence the allude to the PR value and the impact of jaws earlier. Now, according to the IUCN, only about 23 species are considered safe. And in fact, sharks and rays are among the most endangered and threatened taxa of any animal group in the world. About 25% of them are already threatened with extinction, and this is only getting worse. There's been some very high impact papers looking at the conservation situation in sharks worldwide in Nature recently, and it's dire news. In every case, every year, a new paper comes out and basically said sharks and rays are in more trouble than we thought. Now, of course, our irrational fear of sharks has really big implications when it comes to our interactions with them. Obviously, I've alluded to their conservation status and the will of people to conserve them. But probably the biggest problem, of course, is that they're massively overfished. Around 100 million sharks are killed by commercial fishing every year, and this is just the reported landings. There's a heap of unreported landings and a lot of illegal fishing that goes around the world. And at least half of that is for the shark fin industry. And in fact, there are still, even in Australia, it's still legal to bring a shark to the side of the boat, cut its fins off, and throw the rest to the ocean. In some states, they're changing that legislation so that you actually have to land the entire shark. So you have to bring the whole animal to land, and then it can be butchered. At least that way you use the whole animal. And it also minimises the number of sharks that any given vessel can carry at any given time. So overfishing is a massive, massive problem. And the other thing that we do is that we manage sharks to prevent shark bites. Now, that may not be a big thing in Europe, but in places like the US, South America, Australia and New Zealand, it is a big thing because occasionally people are bitten, and generally the public is terrified of sharks, even though it's irrational. The reality is we shouldn't be, but nonetheless, governments play on that fear and they want to be seen to be doing something. So they manage to minimise shark bites. How do they do that? Well, as I mentioned, from time to time, people do get bitten by sharks. So lots of governments are putting in beta protection programs. There's all sorts of ways that they go about doing this. One of them is every time that somebody is bitten by a shark, a fisheries manager just goes out on a boat and shoots a shark, just cowboy style. Whether or not it's the correct shark or anything like that, or even endangered species, doesn't really come into the equation. The other thing is that we have these things called drum lines, which is effectively a big hook on a line with a bit of bait on it. And these things are placed along our coastlines with a view to catching sharks. Now, the idea, of course, is that when you capture those sharks, hopefully they're not dead, but often they are, when you capture them, you remove them, you tag them, and you move them offshore. But of course, if you look at things like tiger sharks and white sharks, which move thousands of kilometres every year, moving them a couple of k's offshore is hardly going to make any difference. They'll be back the next day or the day after. And I often refer to this technique, this management technique, as trying to dig in dry sand. No matter how hard and fast you dig in dry sand, the hole just keeps filling in. Okay? Same kind of thing is happening if you're moving sharks offshore. The other thing we do is we net beaches. Now, people really don't understand how shark nets work, but basically they are literally a fishing net suspended in the water. Sharks can go around them, under them, over the top. But the trouble is, none of these mechanisms are effective. None of them reduce the number of bites or the number of fatalities. So it's a bit of a joke from a science perspective, but in government circles, the managers take these things very seriously. It's kind of a political smokescreen. You've got to be seen to be doing something when the reality is you can't do anything. Sharks nets are particularly controversial in Australia, and they were kind of hidden from the public eye for a long time. People just accepted them. No one really knew what was going on. But recently, the government was forced to start publishing the data from these captures, and, well, hardly surprising, there was an uproar, because the reality is they very rarely catch the target species that they're after, and what they're really doing is catching a whole bunch of other species. And this cartoon really rams that idea home. There's a couple of sharks discussing, what the heck is this thing floating in the water? Oh, it's called a shark net, but I don't understand why. And I don't think anybody actually understands why. Here's the data from the New South Wales meshing program from last year. And you can see why these sorts of programs might be controversial. And in fact, since the release of these data, many of the beachside councils have requested that the nets be removed from their beaches. But it's a state government decision, and fisheries are not budging. You can see that these shark nets, they're laid out for about 8 months of the year, thereabouts, and then they're brought back in. They're no good in the winter because they get smashed by the storms, things like that. But while they're out there, last year in that 8-month period, 480 animals were captured in this program. 90% of them were non-target species, and the vast majority of them were dead by the time the nets were checked. Some target sharks were captured in that year, but in some years there are no target shark captured at all. Quite a lot of white sharks, a couple of bulls and some tigers, and these really are the three species that the meshing program is out to stop. The vast majority of bites are caused by white sharks, occasional bull and tiger sharks. Now you can see that, again, of the 50 sharks, 60-odd% of them were dead by the time anybody got to them. But the worst thing, it's looking pretty bad from a statistical perspective if you're interested in conservation biology or sustainability. But 227 of these 480 animals were threatened or protected animals. 183 of them were dead. And these things include things like dolphins, a whole bunch of turtles, and some critically endangered sharks, grey nurse sharks. Grey nurse shark wouldn't hurt a fly. You can literally swim past them and they wouldn't blink. A whole bunch, nearly 100 of smooth hammerhead sharks listed by the IUCN as vulnerable, all of them dead. A whole bunch of rays, a good number of them dead. Rays actually tend to do a little bit better because they can buccal pump and they don't drown quite so quickly. And of the 50 or 42 white sharks, about 50% of them or more were actually dead by the time they were removed from the nets. And a reminder that white sharks, although they are the target of these schemes, they're actually protected by the IUCN. They're protected internationally, and they're theoretically protected in Australia as well. So this is the target species. When people are talking about controlling problem sharks, rogue sharks, or whatever the media wants to call them, it's white sharks, tiger sharks, and bull sharks. And I just want to talk briefly about each of these species. White sharks is the species that everybody goes to when they think of sharks. This is the stereotypical thing that enters their mind. And look, it's be fair to say that they are reasonably intimidating beasties. On average, they're about 5 meters long. That's like longer than all of my kids lined up side end to end. Still not long enough. I did that experiment the other day with them to illustrate just how long a white shark is, and they got to about 4 and a bit meters. So your average white shark is a big, big animal. The females are bigger still, and they can be 6 meters or more. I think the important thing to note, though, is that they're extremely long-lived, and this goes to explaining at least partially why they're threatened. They live for more than 70 years. Males become adults around about 16, so late teens, whereas females, they don't become adults, that is capable of reproduction, until they're in their late 20s or early 30s. And when they do reproduce, they produce only a few pups per year. I think the record at the moment is perhaps up to 14, but that would be from a very, very big female. And quite often they skip years. If they just haven't got good enough body condition, they just won't breed that year. So you can see they're long-lived, they mature late, their reproductive rate is very slow. And of course, if you're interested in population turnover, alarm bells should be ringing in your mind, because anything that happens to these animals is clearly going to have a big and lasting impact on population viability. So, of course, they're highly vulnerable to human activities like fishing programs of overfishing and bather protection programs. And scientists from the CSIRO, which is like the Australian research arm, have estimated that off the east coast of Australia and New Zealand, there's only about 750 adult white sharks left. So they're in trouble. How about tiger sharks? Tiger sharks, unlike white sharks, which are a bit more cool temperate, these guys are a little bit more tropical. They're currently listed as near threatened, but if you look at the data from the Queensland fishing programs and shark control programs, there's been a 70% decline in their numbers in the last 30 years alone. And the Queensland Shark Control Program, so their bather protection program effectively, has killed 2,500 of these things in the last 20 years. They're a little bit like white sharks, not quite as big. They mature a bit earlier, but they still live for a really long time. And check out the gestation period. The gestation period on these guys is 16 months. Of course, the humans, it's 9 months, right, for the baby to develop inside the mother. These guys, it's 16 months. Litters are reasonably large, up to 80, but it's nearly always every second year. And 80 would be exceptional. That would be from a very, very big female. But the cool thing about tiger sharks is that they're basically known to be sort of garbage eaters. They're scavengers of the sea. They're cleaning up all the leftovers that need to be eaten, and all sorts of amazing things come out of their stomachs when people do autopsies on dead sharks, tiger sharks. These guys, as I mentioned, they tend to be more tropical, perhaps slightly subtropical, but like white sharks, they're very wide-ranging. They're a bit unpredictable. You never know where they're going to go, and each individual is unique in how it moves around. The last one to talk about is bull sharks. And as I mentioned, bull sharks are responsible for some, but in fact, very few of the bites and or deaths in Australia are caused by bull sharks. And that is somewhat surprising because Bull sharks, although they're not as big, they're still a decent size, 3.5 or so meters in length. These guys actually are interesting because they are coastal, spend a lot of time in estuaries, but in fact, unlike most sharks, they can tolerate full fresh water. So you often find them way up river systems into complete fresh water. And if you consider that, most of the populations in most countries are on coastal systems or on the rivers, it's a little bit surprising that more people aren't bitten by bull sharks every year. But I think that is really speaking to the fact that sharks are not targeting people. There's lots of people in the water. Think about Sydney, for example. It's on Sydney Harbour. There's about 6 million people, and nearly all of them are in the water all summer long. And they're almost always swimming side by side with bull sharks and various other things. Hardly anyone ever gets bitten by these things. So they're kind of interesting. They're currently listed as near threatened as well, but from our best guess is that those population levels are pretty stable. The key thing to realise is that as top predators, sharks really play key roles in marine ecosystems. They're kind of like, I guess, the barometer for ecosystem health. If you've got a decent, healthy population of sharks in the ecosystem, then generally speaking, you can assume that the ecosystem is in a reasonable state. Anything you do to top-level predators has a big impact on the rest of the system. Basically everything underneath them is affected by the top-level predators. And it's difficult to explain this in a marine environment because there's a lot of complexity and a fair bit of redundancy in marine ecosystems and food webs generally. But to bring it really home to things people would understand is removing sharks from marine ecosystems is a bit like taking all the big cats from the Serengeti. It would be catastrophic. The massive changes that you would get, increases in the mammals, grazing mammals in that system would be catastrophic. The populations would bloom, they would graze the grass and everything else till there's nothing left and the entire ecosystem would collapse. So that's the kind of impact that one could have by removing top-level predators. And it's a little bit more complicated in marine systems, but the fundamental idea is the same. So how do we go about better managing sharks in the future? And I think it would be fair to say that what we need to do is start with science and we leave our caveman instincts behind. Forget about your useless attempt at estimating risk. Stop demonizing sharks and start loving sharks and realize that the value that they play in these marine ecosystems. And of course, the key thing is we need more information about shark behaviour. What drives sharks to do the sorts of things they do? Hopefully I've convinced you that we need to understand them, we need to manage them, and we need to stop demonizing them, in fact, they're not out to kill us. And in fact, if anything, they've got far more to be worried about from us rather than vice versa. Now what I'm going to do is convince you that despite the fact that Hollywood and media would have you believe that sharks are out there to get you and they're these mindless killing machines, the reality is they're way smarter than we give them credit for. In my lab, we've been studying shark cognition in both the lab and in the field for, more than 10 years now. So I kind of switched from studying fish behaviour, bony fishes, and moved into sharks and rays. And that's largely because I suddenly had a whole bunch of PhD students who were shark nuts. So I think I'm going to spend the next period of time just going over some of the experiments we've done to illustrate how smart sharks are. Now, you might actually be more terrified of sharks when you realise how intelligent they are. But, the fact is they've been around for a really long time and they have a pretty decent brain to body size ratio. So they're pretty smart beasties and they should be doing something with that big brain that they have. Much of the work we do in the field involves tagging sharks of various species. To do that, basically, we capture them in one way, shape or form. If they're, benthic ones, little benthic ones, then you can just catch them on hand, on snorkel or scuba. In all cases, we basically tag them with these acoustic tags. This is a 10-year tag, a V16. You can see the size of it here. And we anaesthetize the sharks. We do an incision. Basically, it's a surgery. Means put the tag inside their body cavity, sew it up, put some super glue, wake them up and release them. And basically these tags give off an acoustic signal. It's a very specific acoustic signal at a given frequency. And that signal is picked up by these receivers. You can see the receivers over here. And these receivers are basically telling us that every time a shark comes within range, it tells us who they are and when they were there. And from that, you can get all sorts of cool information about their behaviour, where they are, who they're hanging out, how often they move, these sorts of things. And over the years, we've got some pretty cool data from all sorts of species that we've tagged. We started most of this work working on Port Jacksons. They're a really cool little shark, about 1.5 meters. And at the time we started working with these beasties, we only knew that they showed up in really big numbers along the coast of New South Wales, that's the east coast of Australia, during the winter months. And then they vanished. Nobody really knew where they went. So we went out and we tagged them. We've tagged, I don't know, 150 or 160, something like that now. And it turns out that they do this huge migration. So they come up to the east coast in the winter months, they come into the embayments, they breed, and then they leave. And the vast majority of them are migrating all the way down to Tasmania, into Bass Strait, which is a return journey of about 1,000 k's. And it turns out they're not only doing this incredible journey, but they're coming back to the same bay every year. And more than that, they're coming back to the same rocky reef within the bay every year. You look at those site fidelity numbers that I've got there up on the screen. Every year, 100% of males come back to exactly the same rocky reef that we saw them the year before. 64% of the females return to the same reef, and that's largely because they're skipping years. If they're not in good condition, they just don't return. So that suggests that these guys have incredible navigation skills, and that's just typical of a whole bunch of migratory species. The other cool thing we can do with this tracking data is figure out who's hanging out with who and when. And by doing that, we can kind of probe the social intelligence of sharks, get into their private lives. To do that, we do this thing called a social network analysis. And a social network analysis is basically what Google and Facebook and everybody else is doing with your data right now. Every time you like something, they know, and they keep track of that information. They can track your interactions across a social network. Now, social networks are a really powerful way of quantifying social relationships, and we can use it in lots of different ways, including things like, and this is important during COVID, tracking disease information and flow of diseases through populations. And if you're interested in social learning, you can also track the flow of social information through populations and even predict how it might move through populations. And it can be a really powerful tool for conservation and management. You can see here a social network where we have girls and boys in blue and pink. It's a bit stereotypical. But interestingly, there seems to be two clusters. There's this big cluster over here and a smaller cluster over here. And importantly, that cluster is basically held together by, perhaps 3 individuals. And that's interesting because if those 3 individuals were removed, whether it be from fishing or whatever, then you would get fragmentation of the population, which may be catastrophic from a conservation management perspective. So there's all sorts of cool information that you can glean from these sorts of social networks. And we've studied social networks in a whole bunch of different sharks and rays. Of course, we started in Port Jacksons. This is our go-to. Whenever we want to try something new, we try it on the PJs first. When we looked at the PJ social networks, we found out they have best buddies. The networks are really reliable. They're pretty similar from year to year. They very rarely change. But if you consider the fact that these guys are coming back to the same place year in year out again every year, it's the same place, and it's hardly surprising that their social networks might be consistent from year to year. We know that the network structure is not random. That is, they're actively choosing to hang out with particular individuals. And in the case of Port Jackson sharks, we know that they make decisions based on size and sex, but relatedness doesn't seem to have anything to do with it. We also know that males tend to hang out slightly more with males and females with females, but the cool thing is that both males and females turn out to be equally social. We've also done this in manta rays off the coast of West Papua, and we've done this, in fact, 2 different ways. The first way we did it was using these spots underneath the bellies of mantas, and each individual manta has a unique spot pattern. So you can go out there, spend hours underwater taking video and photographs of these things as they swim past, look at the timestamps, again, figure out who's hanging out with who. We've also done this now with acoustic tags. This is the network that we generated showing 3 subpopulations of these things, but a fair bit of interconnectedness. And it turns out that the social relationships in these animals is way more complex than anything we previously thought. We've done a similar thing, this time looking at reef sharks, black-tip reef sharks in French Polynesia. And in this case, what we did is after we constructed the network, we actually interrogated it to see how robust it would be to fishing pressure. And one way of doing that is you simulate fishing pressure by randomly removing individuals from the network and seeing how long it takes for the network to collapse. You can see various measures and different methods of removing those individuals from the population and the impact it has on network structure. And I guess the good news is in these relatively pristine environments, there's actually a fair bit of redundancy. Despite the fact that it looks like there's 3 separate populations, the interconnectedness and level of redundancy in those social relationships is such that it takes a fair bit of fishing pressure to have an impact on these sorts of populations. This is in French Polynesia. It's not the same sort of thing that you would see in heavily fished areas. Incidentally, one of the things we discovered when we were doing this study is that when you try to catch the sharks, they eventually learn to stay away from them. So there's this learned avoidance, which means that it's very difficult. It becomes increasingly difficult to recapture individuals. And that kind of hook avoidance kind of behaviour has been observed in a whole bunch of species. We've also done similar sorts of observations, both visually and using acoustic tags in smooth rays. Smooth rays are these huge things. These guys are amongst the biggest rays in the ocean. They're more than 200 kilos, a couple of meters in wingspan. Tell you, wrestling one of these things is entertaining as you try to tag it. Of course, they can sting you and kill you, which is an added benefit. Now, one of the cool things that we found with these guys is that in particular locations, they come in close to shore to scavenge on fish discards, often at boat ramps and places where people are cleaning their fish and throwing the scraps into the sea. And we found that in these contexts, you get these really complicated social interactions. And using a mixture of hierarchy and social network analysis, which is called heterarchy, we've discovered that, in fact, when they're competing over scraps in this context, the social relationships that you observe is similar to what you would see in a despotic society. And it's centered around this really big girl called Raylene. We spent hours making up names for these things. It was so much fun. Raylene is basically the center. She's the queen. She lays out the rules to everybody else. And these sort of complex social interactions and despotic societies are the sorts of things that you would typically see in primates and other highly social mammals. First time anybody had seen anything quite so complicated in a shark or ray. Bear in mind that nobody really looked before. This is a similar population, same kind of situation, except this is using acoustic tag data. And one of the things we were interested in was trying to figure out whether or not these stingrays are basically trained to come to the food scraps at particular times of day. And one of the things we noticed when we were doing the previous social study was that the rays just totally showed up really reliably at certain times of the day. And so after we tagged a whole bunch of them and put out a bunch of receivers, we found that indeed they tend to show up at the boat ramp between 10 and 2, and particularly on Saturdays and Sundays. And it turns out that is exactly the time where the fishermen are normally doing their, they've come home from a day of fishing, a morning of fishing, and they're cleaning their fish and throwing the scraps into the ocean. So the rays have learnt this, and so they come and anticipate that at this particular time and place, there will be free food on offer. You can see the data here, various different receivers in different locations, upstream of the boat ramp, at the boat ramp, downstream, and right at the creek mouth. And really the interesting thing happens at the boat ramp. You can see that the days of the week, it's highest on the weekends at either end here, Saturday and Sunday. And in terms of the hour of the day, they're mostly hanging out between 10 and 2. And you can see that, in fact, that it looks like they're hanging out downstream slightly, and then they move upstream in anticipation. So that's really cool. These things are anticipating this food showing up, and they even show up at the same time in the same place, even when it's raining and there are no fishermen there. And I guess they get disappointed when there are no scraps thrown into the sea. But it just goes to show you how easily these things are trained. They're very, very good at picking up on these sorts of reliable indicators of food availability. And this is a really nice example of time-place learning. In the wild, it's been shown in captivity in a whole bunch of different fish species, but nobody had seen this kind of thing in the wild before. Another example, in this case, we were working in the Bahamas at Bimini. If anybody's a shark freak, it's one of the best shark labs in the world. And in this case, what we really wanted to know was how quickly sharks or rays could learn about provisioning events, particularly events that are predictable in time and space. So what we did is we went to a little spot called AS Spot, and we started providing food at a certain time of day. In fact, we tried to do it on the high tide. And of course, we radio tracked a bunch of lemon sharks. There's a whole bunch of receivers, as you can see, around AR Spot, which is this little inlet here. And what we did is we provided food every day for 27 days. So it was quite predictable at the same time relative to the tide in the same place. And what we found is that after just 11 days, sharks started to anticipate the food being provided by showing up within an hour or so before the food was actually there. You can see on the graph here, this is the baseline data, what happens to the sharks under normal circumstances. They don't really give a crap about what's going on in that particular place at that particular time. Fair enough, they had no reason to. Then when we started feeding them, of course, there are a lot of sharks showing up when we're feeding, but this is the hour before. Look, they're anticipating that food is going to be arriving. We then stopped that provisioning experiment, but we continued to monitor the sharks. And for 30 days after we stopped, for 60 days after we stopped, and even up more than 90 days after we stopped provisioning them, they still were showing up at that time, at that place, expecting to be fed. So it's quite obvious that the sharks not only learn this thing really, really quickly, but they retain that information for a very long time. Fair enough, they were getting a really good feed for 27 days very predictably, but 3 months later, the food hasn't shown up for a really long time. The sharks are still showing up expecting to be fed. This is an example of social learning in the same place and in Bimini. In this case, we set up this really big enclosure. This is just half of the enclosure here. And we taught a bunch of sharks a reasonably complicated thing that they had to do. Basically, they had to come into this indicator zone here. When they came into that indicator zone, over here, the target was revealed, and they had to swim from the indicator zone to the target to get a food reward. Once they got the reward, the target was hidden again, and in order for it to be revealed again, they had to swim back into the indicator zone and then come back, hit the target, and get their food reward. And we trained these guys in 5 sessions a day over many days, and eventually, of course, we got a whole bunch of what we call demonstrator sharks that were pre-trained to solve this task. The question then becomes, what happens if you put a naive observer in with them? Do they learn how to solve this reasonably complex task? Classic social learning experiments, you have a bunch of individuals that are paired with demonstrators and a bunch of individuals that are paired with sham demonstrators. These are sharks that are really thrown in there. They have no idea what's going on. It's really just a control for social interaction. During the training phase, you can clearly see that the time it takes for these sharks to solve the problem, if they have a demonstrator present, is way faster than a sham demonstrator. The sham demonstrator really have no clue. Fair enough. During the training, the test phase, when the demonstrator is removed and that naive individual is tested by themselves, you can see that they're entering the target zone and the indicator zone way more often than those that have been trained with a sham demonstrator. So they clearly know what's going on, and these poor old ones that have been put in with their socially clueless ones really have no idea what's going on. We'd also taken adult PJs into captivity and tested them to see how quickly they could learn to associate light and bubbles in a classical conditioning paradigm. This is a really big aquarium down near the New South Wales Victoria border. And you can see that in both cases, they learnt that association, well, in less than 10 days. And interestingly, when we tested memory retention, they recorded that or remembered that for at least 40 days after the fact. We've also wanted to know, well, sharks can obviously make decisions about all sorts of things, but they have a whole bunch of sensors, and of course sound travels very well underwater. And fishermen and indeed cage diving operators have said to us repeatedly that they reckon the sharks have recognised the sound of their boat engines and actually approach the boats just as they're pulling into the location. So what did we do? Well, in this case, we asked the little sharks, well, can you learn to associate the sound, any sound? In this case, we actually used some classical, some jazz music rather, and we asked them, every time you hear this sound, the music, can you go to the right location to get a food reward? And you can see down here, they learn that pretty quickly. There's quite a lot of individual variation, but by the time you get to sort of session 12, 13, 14, 15, they've totally figured it out. This is the time it takes them to eat the food reward. You can see by the time you get to 18 sessions, they're doing it almost instantaneously. And just for kicks, we thought, well, what happens if we play them blues instead of jazz? And they were really confused. Totally didn't figure that out at all. We've also looked at the social behaviour of juvenile sharks, unlike the adults, which we know are pretty social because they hang out with each other, as we saw with the social network analysis. Here we've discovered that, in fact, juvenile sharks are, in fact, antisocial. They really don't care about unfamiliar individuals. And if anything, they're a little bit antisocial. They actually slightly avoid other individuals that they're familiar with. And that's kind of interesting because what we wanted to know was, even though they're a little bit antisocial, could you still train them in a social learning task? In this social learning task, it's pretty straightforward, not as complicated as the one we did in Bimini. Here, all they had to do was either go through this black door or this checkered door to find a food reward. And you can see from the data, this is the correct hole crossing. By far and away, more sharks that were paired with demonstrators solved this task than those that were paired with sham demonstrators. In fact, none of the sham demonstrator sharks solved that task at all. So despite the fact that these guys are kind of antisocial when they're juveniles, they can still learn these sorts of tasks using social learning. One last thing that's kind of interesting, or perhaps second last, is we wanted to know how far back in development are sharks, I guess, conscious of the world around them. When do they start making interesting decisions and their cognition start to kick in? Here we use some PJs, some baby PJs. They're super cute. They're in egg cases, and about developmental stage 11, the egg case naturally breaks open and the water starts to move through the egg. And at that point in time, you can actually take them out of the egg case and hold them in glass jars. But you can also put them in all sorts of awesome contraptions and measure their metabolic rate. In this case, we're actually measuring oxygen consumption. And we expose them to either the smell of a fish, which is potentially scary, or an elasmobranch, in this case a horn shark, which is a renowned predator for baby PJs, particularly while they're still in their eggs. And what's interesting is you can see changes relative to the baseline oxygen consumption in relation to the various cues that they were exposed to. And by about developmental stage 13, they start to differentiate how they respond to these sorts of cues. Here, in response to the teleost smell, they're freezing, and that's a really clever thing to do. If there's a predator and you're stuck in your shell, well, you don't have much choice. What you try to do is you reduce your movement, you shut down your breathing, and you hope that the animal passes by without noticing. By the time they get to stage 15, they're really hatched, and this is what they look like at stage 15. The yolk's kind of internalized here. They've got a big fat belly, pretty cute. And they are actually responding to the smell of elasmobranch cues with a fight or flight response. So they're clearly having different responses across the developmental phases. The last thing I wanted to point out, and I think this is really important, and that is that sharks are, like most animals, going to be impacted by climate change. Their distribution is going to change, their behaviour is going to change, all sorts of things. What we want to know is, well, is their intelligence going to change? And so here we reared fish in two different temperatures. Current day temperatures, on average about 20.6, and projected temperatures 23.6. In fact, we're already halfway there. And in fact, some summers we exceed 3 degrees already in Southeast Australia. And we wanted to know what impact that has on their cognition. And the first thing is that when you rear them in these temperatures, you actually get quite a lot of mortality at high temperature. A lot of them just don't make it. And many of them hatch but then die. And that's because they basically use up their energy reserves before their development is complete. Interestingly, though, the ones that do survive, they tend to become more strongly lateralised. So their strength of lateralisation increases and they develop this really strong right bias. And interestingly, lateralisation has been associated with enhanced cognition in a whole bunch of different species. Here we thought, well, let's see what impacts it has on their ability to count. And here we tested their capacity to differentiate between 3 dots and 6 dots. And it's a pretty straightforward situation. They have to approach the appropriate marker to get a food reward. And not surprisingly, sharks can solve this problem. They can count. But what we find is the hot sharks are better at solving this. 60% of the sharks pass the test, only 33% of the cold sharks don't. And the hot sharks take much shorter days. They learn this way quicker than the cold sharks. So even though not too many sharks are going to survive the marine heat wave, the ones that do survive seem to be super smart. So I think you'll agree that despite the bad rap from Hollywood and media, sharks are not mindless killing machines that we've been led to believe. And in fact, our work suggests that they have a cognitive tool set that's similar to the rest of the vertebrates. But sharks are highly intelligent animals, really shouldn't come as a surprise. They've dominated the oceans for the past 500 million years, but we can only hope that they make it through the Anthropocene. I'd like to finish with special thanks to all the PhD students and postdocs who have contributed to this work, and of course the people who pay for this work, Australian government, the zoo, SeaWorld, and various other people, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Culum. Super presentation. And there are some questions for you, of course. So still questions are popping up. So I'm just reading the questions from Natasha Rossi. She's asking, what modality do sharks use during social learning to complete the task? Is it visual?
Yes, well, they use a whole bunch of different cues. In our case, it's primarily visual in the social learning task. And that's because we don't provide the food reward until they've solved the task. So there's no smell of food in the water at all. Of course, if you do provide the smell of food, it really motivates them to find it. So it's actually not a bad way to get them to get excited about these sorts of tasks. You can throw in a bit of early on, or just the smell of food, and it gets them excited. And if you do that, they actually solve it even faster. But it's mostly visual. But as you've seen, we've also done it using streams of bubbles, which is a mixture of mechanosensory as well as visual. There's obviously sound coming through there too. And as you've seen from our experiments with the jazz and the blues music, you can train them using sounds too.
Okay, cool. And another question from A.B. George. Would an increase in pressure from fishing lead to more fragmented and clustered networks, or would the individuals compensate for this by forming new connections?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting topic. One of my PhD students is actually working on this exact question at the moment. At the moment, we know that fragmentation does occur, but we don't know to what extent the reformation of new social interactions buffers that fragmentation process. It's likely that it does, but how it does and to what extent, we still don't know. So that's a question that we are currently addressing. But yes, fundamentally, the idea is that the network is not stable, right? It's not static. It's moving and changing all the time as new sharks come and go, sharks die, sharks leave, and these sorts of things. So yes, that's a really interesting question, and we don't really know the answer.